Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Rosenbaum, and this is a panel dedicated to DevOps Handbook and the future of DevOps. First, I will let my participant introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Patrick Dwoy, and I'm the Director of Market Strategy at Snyk.
Hi, my name is Gene Kim, and I've been studying high-performing technology organizations for 21 years.
Hey, I'm John Willis. I work for Red Hat, and I've been hanging out with Gene and Patrick for good or bad for quite a long time.
Nice. So basically, we are talking about this book in this session. So it's kind of 5 years since the book, 10 years since the whole DevOps thing started. What changed in the 10 years for you all?
Gene?
Oh my goodness, yeah. So I have loved studying, the principles and patterns behind DevOps, and I think what I find most surprising and rewarding is seeing how that even though so many of the practices were pioneered by the tech giants, the Facebooks, Amazon, Netflix, Googles, Microsofts, it really is being embraced by every organization across every industry vertical, regardless of company size, regardless of industry vertical, and using it to compete and win in the marketplace. And Patrick and I, we had a chance to work together for the DevOps Enterprise Summit that was virtual last week. And one of the things I got so much gratification out of was just to see the seniority of the people speaking, showing that DevOps matters to people who matter, that it really is impactful for organizations, and so that was just I think year after year continues to awe and amaze me in terms of DevOps's impact, on any organization that has technology in the way that they create value for customers.
I think I double down on that. I think that remember in the early days, right? There was this question. I think we all intuitively knew that this was going to have roots in the enterprise, but going into sort of that first DevOps Enterprise Summit, when we put out the CFP, there's still, to me, I'm like, what we think and what we know, and then we saw so many contributions in the CFP from large enterprises, and then over the years, year after year, it's just more enterprises, more executive level people coming, and just the growth and the manifestation of DevOps in the enterprise at every level. Has been very happy to see that play out.
Just as you predicted 11 years ago, right, Patrick?
Yes.
So this seems to be an inside joke, but I know that 10 years ago when we were trying to talk to people about continuous delivery and DevOps, right? Most people would be like, oh yeah, this will never work here, right? The small companies would be like, oh, this is only good for Google. And the big companies like, oh, we're 40 years old. What are you talking about? We could never transform, right? But now it seems like every CEO and CTO are going through the digital transformation for their company. So from your experience on maybe consulting on this or working with companies doing this, what are the biggest challenges that you see?
John, that's one for you, man.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, one of the sort of real evidence, right, is when you hear banks say that chaos engineering is a critical piece of the way to banking, right? Like that's, so we've crossed over, we're solidly on Terraform here, right? Where, to your point, that back in the day, people would say they could never do infrastructure as code in the enterprise, or this idea of continuous deployment could never happen. And now you're hearing financial companies talk about chaos engineering as not only something we're thinking of doing, we can't live without. So yeah, I think again the maturity of both the technology. That's the beauty of this whole thing, right? Is that there, back in the day there was this convergence of open source, cloud technology, and this new way of thinking, the sort of culture of this DevOps thing, and it was all sort of colliding. And to watch that now today, where the technology is insane, and it's still at the collaborative efforts is still at par with the technology, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think for using another buzzword, Devsecops or whatever. The fact that we're finally getting the whole business to agree that this is bringing value, and also, what I've studied recently is more about finding that IT might not be the only bottleneck. So it could be in different parts. It could be, in your hiring process. It could be in your sales process, and they all need to align. And that kind of global optimization we first thought about, like dev and ops, kind of, optimizing that tension point, is now across a company or across the whole company transformation. It's balancing those kind of ecosystems together, that the optimum of the global business is actually reached, instead of the IT level only or the finance level only.
Yeah, by the way, one of the things I love about where this movement is taking us is just now, as often as Patrick was alluding to, we need aspirations and dreams big enough, for the technology organization to really step up and contribute to. One of the ones that really rocked my world last year was hearing the U.S. Bank talk about how they create a cross-functional team across all of business, risk, and technology, and enable small businesses to apply for loans and get approved and have hundreds of thousands of dollars of money wired into their bank accounts within minutes or hours. And so that, to me, that just shows that the bar is indeed being raised, and I think that's what we need. Aspiration is big enough, for us to really move the needle in terms of what matters to customers. And by the way, just to share a story, to what John said, I think it's so great that so many things that we found so shocking 11 years ago, for example, the 10 deploys per day at Flickr by John Alspaugh and Paul Hammond, we now take for granted. As you were saying, Sasha. I actually heard from Mike Nygaard, that the author of the Release It book. He said when he first heard about the 10 deploys a day presentation, he thought that maybe they weren't lying, but they were using some sort of slippery definition of deployment that didn't match up with his. He said, we do 10 a year, and that doesn't translate very well to to good outcomes. So these days, I think that's what we really expect in a high performing team.
And like you mentioned, you do research on this stuff, right? And the most surprising thing that came out of that research is that speed is not an opposite of quality, right? Actually, when you move faster, you actually break things less, right? Because you develop the muscle for actually doing this well, right?
Oh.
I think I want to pivot a little bit and ask a question about, DevOps has been transformed into many, many buzzwords, right? One of the latest buzzwords that's been gaining popularity is Devsecops. And I know John and Patrick have been talking about this. So maybe kind of talk about what's different between DevOps and Devsecops.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because it's interesting. I've written about this a couple of times about like sort of DevSecOps. Get over it; it's just a name. But early on, everybody wanted to change the name DevOps, right? And there was a lot of us, yourself, Joshua, all of us were like, don't change the name. It's just a metaphor, right? Like you don't have to call biz dev, marm, and then DevSecOps came along, and Shannon Leitz coined it, and I'm like, go argue with Shannon. She's brilliant. But the thing was, it two things that I think sort of broke the glass, into my opinion. One is it got people excited, and that's what DevOps did, right? So I didn't want to throw out the name, and I had good friends call me, John, please don't use that name, and but it got people excited, and I remember being at RSA, we would run a DevOps track, pre-track, and we called it DevSecOps, and all of a sudden a ton of security people showed up, and I asked them, why are you here? And they were like we feel like we were invited. So I think that sometimes you have to use a name. But I want to say that now what's funny is I always said I wish there'll be a day where we don't have to use the name. And I'm actually seeing that, because what happens now, I go into large banks and I hear them call it the DevSecOps pipeline, right? And so that means they're actually already sort of combining the name. They don't say, well, there's the DevOps pipeline and there's and so, maybe sort of mission accomplished, but it's a weird thing to hear it called the DevSecOps pipeline, but to them it means everything. It means everything you're doing for continuous delivery and pipeline, and it has the security overlay. So again, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. So I think basically the two biggest points you mentioned is giving people common language to talk about something, right? So labels are important because they give us a shared language to define things. And then also inviting people to the table, which could be problematic for all the other people, like, dev marketing ops, dev rel ops, dev everything else ops. But hey, security is important. What I think is, like, when I look at the world of security today, I feel like it's just in the beginning of this journey into automation, right? So security is often perceived as something that's manual, that's done by people, that can't be automated. And I think maybe DevSecOps kind of tells me a story of we're starting the journey of doing better at this in taking away routine tasks. Like, right, again, we're not taking away your job, we're making it better by giving you more time to think about more interesting problems. Is that kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we had Chris Porter. He's the Chief Information Security Officer, Fannie Mae, speak with their Chief Operations Officer, his boss, Kimberly Johnson. And he said there was a day when in security we felt our job was to protect developers from themselves. And he said we've abandoned that line of thinking, right? He said we don't care who does the work as long as somebody does the work. And the goal is to create these paved roads where if you go down the paved road, life is going to be great. It's going to be fast. Everything's built into the pipelines. If not, it's going to be potholes, and you can get pulled over by the local law enforcement officials, right, and potentially hassled. So I thought that was just a really neat way of, I think, a big change in security where everything was around PDF files and GRC tools. Instead, really is integrating into the daily work of developers. That's definitely not the way I was trained 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think so. Like, if we go back to the Phoenix project, right? There's this image of security as a blocker standing between me and deploying my code, right? And that's how we used to think about it. But the thing is, like, we have to bring. So this is something we talk about at GitHub a lot. Is there's millions of developers in the world, and there's less than 100,000 security researchers. Like, we can't, like, they can't be the one thing that stands between us and getting hacked, right? Like, we have to bring people to the table and solve these problems together. So I love the feature flags that you just mentioned. Is there any other security best practices that we can think about implementing that you've seen around that you would recommend people look at?
One of my favorite ones that it came from the guy who invented the OWASP dependency check project, Jeremy Long. And he said one of the best ways to be secure is just to keep your dependencies up to date. I love that. And he gave the example of the prime faces vulnerability where there was a certain Java library that, a CVE was disclosed, and suddenly every production version was taken over by Bitcoin miners. But it turned out that that vulnerability was actually fixed 2.5 years prior. And so had you just stayed current, you would have been, not at risk of that vulnerability. And of course, that's not easy, right? Because, the experience of many developers is that if you stay up to date, when you update your dependencies, you break everything.
Yeah, and I think it brings up the fact of trust, right? We're using a lot of the external dependencies, and we're kind of just going with it, and we expect that to be secure, right? And it is in promise theory. You say you decide your own fate, so that means you have to make it secure. You can't rely on others. They can make promises to you, but it is never an absolute. And that's the same thing with external services or libraries that you use, or even other groups or microservices that you use. You kind of have to take your own destiny in hands and make sure that you have an alternative path when things happen. With libraries and scanning, that's only one part, but you still have to be resilient if they do fail, because there's always the window of opportunity that's not going to happen. But on the flip side as well, we have to become trustworthy to others. So it's not only others that need to do the work for us. We need to become trustworthy to others. So as a security person, we need to help others. We need to be there on time. When the backlog is discussed, or we have to understand that there's a business reason why something has to go into production, even if we do know there's a vulnerability, and kind of building up that relationship, being trust others and being trustworthy. And I know in security it's really hard, because one rule is trust nobody. But it is part of that, building that trust over time that will make the difference, in my opinion.
And so I'm going to jump into this again. You can see I feel strongly about this, but the check but verify everything is also insane in terms of cognitive load, right? As a person, I'm not going to reverse engineer every single library I download, right? So that's why I say we have to automate this. And luckily, there's more and more tools in this market, including some from Snykcon or some from GitHub, that can allow you to actually go and automate these things away, so they're maybe not completely transparent, but at least easier for you to do as a security professional.
I was just going to add, last year, so Gene runs a forum where a bunch of us go to Portland every year and we work on these papers. And I don't know, there's like 75 of these papers now. And last year was it Nike, PNC, Capital One, Marriott, and Mike Nygaard at Sabre. We wrote a paper about it. We call it DevOps Automated Reference Architecture, where basically the idea was that you start creating digital evidence sort of in the model of a blockchain of everything that happens as you're doing things. So you move from a subjective model of describing all these changes in the change record to actual digitally signed evidence. And what that does is it doesn't solve all your problems, but now you have a clear case. You can sort of replay. You can find the needle. You don't have to find the needle in the haystack. And more important, when you work with the risk people to sort of drive those controls into that automated governance, which some companies are doing right now, you shorten the feedback loop between the real risks and the sort of 1990 risks that like are just sitting there that people have to deal with. And you're able to sort of scale those out, figure out the ones that are real, and you start creating a tighter feedback loop between what really is sort of risk worthy and is non-human derived. So I do think that's one of the, because the bottom line is the dependency map, like what we can put in every dependency manager out there, we can add a gazillion vulnerability scans. Sorry, it is a nightmare. And you get into Node, I mean, just talk for 5 minutes about how scary Node is, right? So I'm not saying we can't do all those things, but our best, I think our best defense is, clear attestation models of everything gets delivered every time, every delivery.
I do think that the tools are definitely getting better. So like if it used to be that it was all false positives and kind of almost useless to read the reports, they're definitely getting much more accurate in the last few years. So this is the point of this recording where I ask you to predict the future. So what do you think? How do you think the DevSecOps world will evolve in the next 10 years?
I hope, I can't predict, I don't have a glass ball, but I hope they're actually going to get closer to using production feedback to make decisions in the developer stack for security. So that we're closing that feedback loop, not just devs and sec working together or sec and ops, but kind of the whole pipeline feeding back to decisions. And I think there's a multitude of products and companies that will try to tackle that feedback loop as well.
I'm terrible at prognostication, but I mean, my hope, to use Patrick's language, is that, we're nearing 100% of, market share in terms of, the way people work. I mean, my best guess is, we're 5% of the way there, right? IDC says there's about 20 million developers on the planet. I love the GitHub stats. The numbers are even bigger than that, like 40 million. But I think, if how many people are actually working in the real DevOps-y like way, and I think it's like at best it's 1 million, right? And so that means, we're 2%, 5% of the way there. And so we know how important DevOps is. We know how much value it creates. And so my fondest hope is that, over the next 10 years, that number just keeps going up and hopefully reaches, high double digits. So that's my hope.
And I'll just add, I think I would like to see a world where risk controls are part of the ideation, fluently part of the ideation, so that we're not living in this sort of, 1,000-column spreadsheets or these old risk controls that mandate how, almost everywhere you go, even today in 2020, you'll hear it takes me a week to development and it takes me another 6 weeks to actually get it into production. And it's just arcane 20, 30, 40-year-old risk controls that can't be arbitrated. I think there's a world coming where risk will actually be involved in ideation, be part of story, as clear as we've accomplished it with ops, we get that with risk. And so risk is just a development flow, and it's less about static control definitions and more about ideation. So.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming together. I super enjoyed this conversation. It was too short, so hopefully we get to talk together again soon. And thanks everyone for coming. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Sasha.
Bye. Hey, thank you, everybody. Yeah.